Shakespeare once said, "All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players." What he meant was that life is like a performance. We move through different roles and stages. We enter, we evolve, we exit. And we begin as children, then teenagers, adults, partners, parents, if we choose. Life moves. Roles are meant to change. Identity is meant to evolve. At least that is what's supposed to happen. But for many people with anxiety, that evolution gets interrupted. The body grows up, you grow up, but psychologically, emotionally, at a nervous system level, part of them remains stuck in an old role. The good girl, the good boy, the achiever, the responsible one who never gets it wrong, the one who holds everything together. And because that role once helped them survive, they keep performing it at work, in relationships, in parenting, in life. Different environment, same role. Different people, same survival pattern. And eventually that performance becomes exhausting because what often looks like high functioning anxiety isn't just anxiety. It is often a nervous system still operating by an old rule. My worth depends on how well I perform. And when I say performance, I don't just mean work. I mean performance in life, performance in relationships, in parenting, performance in business, performance in sport, performance in how productive, helpful, successful, intelligent, attractive, or likable you are. And that creates enormous pressure. Because when performance becomes identity, mistakes stop feeling like mistakes. They feel personal. And failure doesn't just feel disappointing, it feels like something is wrong with me. And that is where anxiety starts making perfect sense. Let me give you two examples. I worked with a client and we'll call her Irene. On the outside, Irene looked highly capable, intelligent, responsible, competent, but internally, she lived with severe performance anxiety. As we worked together, something became very clear. Irene didn't grow up feeling that love and approval were freely given. Approval increased when she achieved, when she got things right, when she made people proud. But mistakes felt dangerous. They brought criticism, disappointment, tension, disconnection. So her nervous system learned a very powerful rule early in life. If I perform well, I'm safe. If I get it wrong, connection feels threatened. And that rule followed her into adulthood. At work, if she didn't know something, panic. If she made a mistake, spiral. If she felt judged, exposed, or incompetent, her nervous system reacted like she was in danger. And this is important. Performance-based worth doesn't always create high achievement. Sometimes it creates avoidance. Irene became so afraid of failure that she would avoid situations where she might be exposed. And sometimes she would pull back before she even gave herself the chance to fully step into her potential. Because subconsciously, avoidance felt safer than failure. Think about that. Not because she was lazy, not because she lacked ability, because her nervous system believed failure carried emotional danger. Eventually, the pressure became unbearable. and she completely broke down. She became heavily medicated and admitted herself into a private inpatient facility. And here's something important. During that time, she was journaling, attending group therapy, taking the medication, learning coping strategies. And while some of those things helped stabilize her temporarily, they barely touched the real issue. Why? Because the real issue was never simply anxiety symptoms. The real issue was the unconscious rule driving her entire nervous system. I must get it right to be safe and to be loved. And I must perform well to be worthy. Until that rule changes, the nervous system keeps producing anxiety. Because from its perspective, anxiety is protective. And now, you might listen to Irene's story and think, okay, that makes sense for someone with obvious performance anxiety. But here's where it gets interesting. Performance-based worth doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like overachievement. Sometimes the nervous system doesn't respond by shutting down. It responds by pushing harder, achieving more, proving more, performing more. Which brings me to another client. We'll call her Jillian. Jillian looked completely different from Irene. She was ambitious, driven, successful, competitive, high achieving. But underneath, same wound, different expression. Jillian grew up in an environment where achievement was highly valued. Being impressive got attention. Winning got praise. And falling short often triggered comparison or self-criticism. Over time, achievement stopped being something she did. It became who she was. And her life became one giant scoreboard. Everything was measured. Everything was evaluated. Everything became evidence. Evidence that she was winning or losing. Enough or not enough. For example, she would go skiing with friends, and most people might think, I'm having fun with my friends. Instead, Jillian's mind would go to, am I as good as them? Am I behind? Why am I not better? And this showed up in other areas of her life too. She would go on dates, but instead of asking, do I even like this person? Are we compatible? Do our values align? Her nervous system would go straight to, what does he think of me? Will he like me? Why hasn't he texted? Did I say something wrong? Am I enough? And if a man was inconsistent or flaky, rationally, part of her knew his behavior said more about him than about her. But survival patterns are not rational. Her nervous system responded as if inconsistency confirmed an old wound, that she wasn't enough. And this is what many people miss. The issue wasn't skiing or dating. The issue was the meaning her nervous system attached to outcomes. Every outcome became a referendum on self-worth. That is the tragedy of performance-based living. You stop living your life and you start evaluating your life. You stop experiencing moments. You start scoring moments. Am I winning? Am I behind? Am I enough? How do I compare? And presence becomes almost impossible because you're never fully here. You're always chasing the next result, the next achievement, the next validation, the next proof that you're enough. Now, what's fascinating is this. Irene and Jillian looked completely different. One collapsed under fear of failure. The other lived under relentless pressure to achieve. Different behaviors, same wound. Both were living under the same unconscious rule. I am only worthy when I perform. And this is why high functioning anxiety is so exhausting, because the outside may look impressive, but the nervous system never rests. It's always scanning, always proving, always performing, always trying to stay safe. Now, hear me carefully. I'm not against ambition. I'm very ambitious myself. I'm not telling you to stop caring, to stop achieving, to stop wanting to do well. That is not the goal. Performance is not the problem. The problem is when your identity depends on performance. Healthy ambition says, I want to do well. Survival says, I need to do well or I'm not enough. Huge difference. And this is also why mindset alone often doesn't work. You can tell yourself, I am enough. Mistakes are okay, and I don't need to prove myself. And consciously, you may even believe that. But then something happens. A mistake, a complaint, a setback, a feedback from your boss, someone rejects you, you feel behind, and suddenly your body reacts like you're in danger. Why? Because this pattern isn't just cognitive, it is subconscious, emotional, nervous system based. Which brings me to something important. And this is exactly why the work I do is different from approaches that stay mostly at the conscious level. We don't need years to endlessly analyze every anxious thought or behavior. We need accuracy. We need to identify the pattern generating the symptoms. Because I'm less interested in spending years talking about every anxious thought or behavior. And I'm sure you are too. What I want to know is, what role did your nervous system learn to adopt for survival? The achiever? The good girl or the good boy? The responsible one? The perfectionist? The one who never needs help? What is the role? And once we identify the role, we identify the rule driving that role. Rules like, I must get it right. I must not disappoint. I must be chosen. I must prove my worth. I must hold everything together. And once we identify the pattern and the emotional imprint underneath it, that is where we work. In the subconscious, in emotional memory, in the nervous system. Because healing is not about becoming someone new. It is about realizing you no longer need the role that helped you survive. The role that protected you in childhood may be the exact thing exhausting you in adulthood. And in many ways, this work helps people finally step off that old stage. Because you don't heal by becoming a different person. You heal by recognizing that the beliefs helping you survive as a child may now be the very beliefs keeping you stuck as an adult. So if you struggle with high functioning anxiety, I want you to ask yourself one question. Who did I learn I had to become in order to feel worthy? Because that answer often reveals the role you have been performing. And maybe the reason you feel exhausted isn't because life is too hard. Maybe it's because you've spent years performing a role your nervous system still believes you need in order to be safe and loved. You've grown into an adult now. Your life has changed. But part of your nervous system is still operating by rules that were formed by a much younger version of you. Rules that once helped you survive. Rules that may be outdated. And if there is one thing I want you to take away from this episode today, it is this. We enter, we evolve, we exit. But some of you entered, and part of you remained stuck in the role that once kept you safe. Your life changed, but your role didn't. And the beliefs that once protected you may now be the very thing keeping you stuck. So if your worth only exists when you perform, that is not confidence. That is survival. And survival is exhausting.